Hello and welcome to our review of the GTX 1080 Founders Edition. In this review we're going to mainly cover the performance benchmarks that we've compiled at Computer Lounge over the past couple of weeks. We're going to kind of gloss over the technical specs as well as the changes to the architecture for Pascal, as that's been covered extensively by various other media outlets over the past couple of weeks. There are a couple of things I will mention though before we head straight into the benchmarks. First off being that Maxwell represents a node shrink down from the 28nm Maxwell down to 16nm, and with that comes what a lot of people would assume would be a significant boost in performance over the previous generation. So that's something to consider coming into these benchmarks. Another thing that I would like to mention is the technology that Nvidia have actually packed into the Pascal architecture. First and foremost, I guess, being the simultaneous multi-projection, which will really help benefit those who use multi-monitors for gaming. More specifically though, VR. They've managed to, instead of having a single viewport that that's rendered across kind of 3 screens, you can actually have up to multiple viewports that apparently are rendered within a single pass. So that's actually really impressive, and the applications for VR gaming in terms of how efficient it is to actually render out those pixels is really quite impressive. And speaking of VR gaming, we actually finally have an HTC Vive in store at Computer Lounge. We have it set up and running so customers can come in and try out virtual reality and see if it's something that they themselves want to invest in. And we will be doing VR content in the future, so we will be testing the 1080, the 1070, the SLI performance in terms of VR applications as well, once we have a more kind of standardized benchmarking system set up. To create all of our results, we used 2 identical test benches. Each one consisted of a Z170 Deluxe motherboard from Asus, a 750i power supply, and 16GB of DDR4 Vengeance RAM from Corsair. We also included a 250GB Samsung Evo SSD, and lastly an i7-6700K from Intel. Now, just a quick word on the benchmarks. The way in which we went about this testing was to get a good idea of the 4K, 1440p and 1080p performance. The 1080p performance we won't really talk about now because the 1080, just trust me when I say that the 1080 can handle 1080p absolutely fine. So we're going to focus on the 4K and 1440p benchmarks right now. So jumping into the Tomb Raider benchmark, this again was done at 4K at the Ultra preset with everything maxed out. And we can see that the GTX 1080 is pulling 44 frames per second on average with a minimum of 40, and that's a really good result for 4K, about 12 frames per second above the 980 Ti. Down to 1440p, the 1080 set at 81 frames per second with a reasonably high minimum frame rate as well, again beating out the GTX 980 in SLI. So one of the main kind of claims to fame that Nvidia had with the Pascal architecture, and specifically the 1080s, is that the 1080 was allegedly or could perform on par with the 980s in SLI. So that's mainly why we included the 980s in SLI in a lot of these benchmarks, and you don't see any of the other SLI setups within the main kind of core of our benchmarks. So this is going to be something that we kind of focus on within these benchmarks. Moving on to Grand Theft Auto 5, the gap does close quite a bit with the 980 and SLI, with the 980 actually taking out the 1080 in terms of performance, sitting at 75 frames per second on average, whereas the GTX 1080 sits at 70 frames per second average at 4K. So consider again, this is 4K, so the 1080 is actually proving to be a very capable performer at 4K, which is fantastic to see, and that's something I'm really excited about going into the next year of gaming, is having a 4K compatible card that's going to run everything kind of around that 60 FPS plus mark. Moving down to 1440p for Grand Theft Auto 5, the 1080 gets 125 frames per second on average, which is really awesome to see. That's another kind of one of the benefits about the 1080 that I'm seeing kind of crop up in a lot of these benchmarks, is that for anyone who's running a 1440p monitor, especially like the Acer XP27 1HU or the Asus PG27 9Q, where you can go up to 144 Hz, now being able to play a lot of those games at the 100 Hz plus mark at ultra settings is really something I'm quite excited about as well. So you can really take advantage of that higher refresh rate on those 1440p panels. Moving on to Witcher 3, that again is one of the harder games to run at 4K, so the 1080 gets 46 frames per second on average with a minimum of 41. While this isn't quite playable, The 980 Ti again only gets 35 frames per second on average, so not a huge jump. Again, this is 12 frames per second on average, but 11 frames per second on average, but at 4K that makes a big difference, and that's something I'm going to be talking about a little bit later on. The 1080 as well does beat out the 980s and SLI at 34 frames per second, so a good 12 FPS gap between the 980s SLI and the 1080s in this case, which is fantastic to see that Nvidia's claim of the 1080s being on par, if not better than the 980s and SLI being true in this case. So that is again fantastic to see. The Witcher 3 at 1440p, again closing the gap between the 980 SLI and the GTX 1080. So 75 frames per second on average for the 1080 with a minimum of 56, whereas the 980s and SLI was getting 72 frames per second on average. So on par performance between those two. The 980 Ti getting 60 frames per second on average, so 15 frames slower than the 1080 as well, which the 1080 does seem to have a significant leap over the 980 Ti, which is a really good thing to see for anyone who's thinking of upgrading. Now moving on to a more recent title, we have Doom running at 4K. So to have the 1080 run at 59 frames per second on average, which is 60 frames per second essentially, at 4K, at everything maxed out, is freaking awesome. That is really nice to see. The 980 coming in at 48 frames per second on average, so again around about 12 FPS slower than the 1080 on average. We couldn't get the 980s and SLI working on Doom as it doesn't have an SLI profile just yet. So moving down to 1440p for Doom, the GTX 1080 coming in at 126 FPS here. So that kind of really reinforces my point earlier that for those of you playing on a 144Hz panel, you are really going to see some benefit running a GTX 1080 here, whereas the 980 Ti is only getting around 90 FPS on average. So you will get a lot more out of the monitor running a GTX 1080. So moving on to Crysis 3. Can it run Crysis is the question I hear you ask. And Crysis 3 at 4K with a single 1080, not quite just yet. So with a single 1080 we are getting 34 frames per second on average, and it's actually being beaten by the 980 and SLI at 37 frames per second. So the 980 Ti coming in at 27 frames, so there's about a good 6 FPS on average difference between the 1080 and the 980 Ti. This does change, however, when we move into the SLI configurations of the 1080, which we'll talk about in just a second. Down to 1440p for the Crysis 3 benchmark, and we have the 980 SLI again coming in on top at 72 frames per second on average, and the GTX 1080 coming in at 70 frames per second on average. So really, when it comes down to it, the performance is on par. Nvidia are holding true with their statement that the 980s and SLI are about as powerful as a GTX 1080. So that is again fantastic to see. Now when it comes to SLI, the 1080s, we did run into a couple of issues. Getting the Witcher 3 to work, getting some of our other benchmarks to work, Rise of the Tomb Raider and all that kind of stuff, it just refused to work. And the results that we were getting, we don't think are representative of the kind of real world results. I think there were a couple of issues with our systems. So we're going to forego the SLI results for the majority of the benchmarks now. However, we did get Crysis 3 running in SLI, and the performance on that was absolutely outstanding. Crysis 3 running on a GTX 1080 SLI setup at 4K was running at 71 frames per second on average. So Crysis 3 is officially beaten. With a minimum of 56 frames per second and a huge performance leap over the 980 Ti's and SLI at 20 frames per second on average better. So that is a fantastic result from the 1080s. Well done, Nvidia. Moving on to the synthetic benchmarks, we have Firestrike at 4K. So the GTX 1080 and SLI, this was one of the cases where we got SLI running. The GTX 1080 was pulling in 8800 for its score in 4K Ultra. So that was beating out both the 980 Ti's and SLI and the 980s and SLI. A single 1080 compared to a 980 SLI setup was fairly close, so the 1080 was getting 5000 and the 980s and SLI was getting 5800. Just a quick word on SLI scaling. We did see that within Crysis 3, the SLI scaling was really good, and I really hope that's indicative of the kind of scaling we'll expect to see in future games. So especially with the HBM bridge and Nvidia's focus more on the dual card configurations and the kind of taking away from the 3 and 4-way configuration, which was a very niche market to begin with. Moving down to 1440p for Firestrike, so this was at the extreme setting. The GTX 1080 pulling 15,500 for an SLI score, which is really quite phenomenal. The GTX 980 Ti's and SLI coming in at 13,600. The GTX 1080 again not quite trumping the 980s and SLI, so the 1080 getting 9,400 with the 980s and SLI getting 10,200. So with all the performance benchmarks out the way, let's talk about how the card will relate to you as a consumer. The way that I see this card kind of fitting into the market is for those people who actually want to game at 4K and have an enjoyable experience. While that was kind of possible with a 980 Ti, I did find that the 980 Ti did struggle a bit in getting a playable experience, with the frame rates typically being in the 30 to 40 region at Ultra. This for a lot of people is an unacceptable frame rate to play at, with the standard of 60 FPS being buttery smooth. The 1080 does get you that 60 FPS if and only if you are prepared to be a bit liberal with your graphics options and AA for the more demanding titles. So what the 1080 allows us to do is really quite significant, so that will make 4K gaming more of an option for the people who can afford it. Where else I see this card fitting into is the 1440p high refresh rate monitor setup. So for those people running a single panel, so like the Acer XP7 1HU or the PG27 9Q, this is really where you're going to see a lot of benefit as well. As for who would really upgrade to the 1080 from, the previous generation Maxwell, well, that's really, basically across the board, I think it's a good investment. The 970 and 980, you're going to be getting a huge performance increase going to the 1080s, especially considering that this is the Founders Edition card and we have more of the partner boards, which will have better cooling, better performance hopefully out of the box as well. So there'll be more of a discrepancy between the benchmarks there. So that basically wraps up the video. We really hope you enjoyed it. We put a lot of effort into creating that benchmarking suite for you guys, so we really do hope that you appreciate the benchmarks. They're all linked in the post below for the forum post, where we have the 1080 benchmarks, the 1440p benchmarks, as well as the 4K benchmarks, so you can kind of peruse there for a more in-depth and non-time constrained look at the benchmarks. We do have the HTC Vive coming in as well, so if you're in the Auckland region, please do feel free to come down and check it out, interact with the staff. That's basically why it's there, to come give you guys a taste of VR. And hope you liked the video. Subscribe if you want to see more content. And as always, we will see you in the next one. This is Matt from Computer Lounge, signing out.